Now, to improve user experience, we're going to add loading skeletons on this page. So while we're waiting for our backend to return the list of games, we're going to show these loading skeletons. Look one more time. Beautiful. Let's see how we can implement this. First, we need to track the loading state in our hook. So here we should declare another state variable. We initialize this to false and call it is loading. Now, just before we call our API, we set loading to true. And when we are done, we set it back to false. Now, earlier I told you that the right place to do this is in the finally method, but for some reason, this doesn't work with the strict mode turned on. So for now, we have to do this in our callbacks. So when we get the result, here we add a block of code. First, we set the games, and then we set loading back to false. Similarly, if we catch an error, after we set error, we set loading back to false. Now at the end, we need to return is loading from our hook. Now to render a skeleton, we should create a separate component. That component is going to look like a game card, but it's not a game card because we can only render a game card if we have a game object. In this case, we don't have a game, so we want to render a skeleton. So back to our project, here in the components folder, let's add a new file called game card skeleton. Now in this component, first we add a card component. Now inside this card, we are not going to have an image. Instead, we're going to have a skeleton. This is like a placeholder for an image that is being loaded. So we add the skeleton component that is defined in Chakra and give it a height of, let's say, 200 pixels. This is arbitrary. We have to play with different values to see what works. Now, after we add a card body, so we're mimicking the same structure as our game cards, okay? Now, in our game card, in the body section, we have a heading and a bunch of other stuff. Here, we don't have those things, so we should render a skeleton text. Okay, now let's remove React from the top. Good. So our skeleton is ready. Now let's use it in our game grid. So we go to game grid. First, we should add is loading. Now to render skeletons, we need an array with, let's say, 6 items. So we're going to render 6 skeletons. So down here, if we are in the loading state, we're going to map each item in that array to a skeleton component. So let's create a simple array here called skeletons. And we initialize this with numbers like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6. Now we don't need a state variable here because this is not something that is going to change over time. So a local variable or constant is enough here, okay? So here we have our skeletons. Now, in this grid, if is loading is true, then we're going to grab our skeletons and map each skeleton to a game card skeleton component. Now here we should set the key to skeleton. Okay, let me save the changes so the code is reformatted. All right, now let's see what we get. So refresh. All right, we have a layout issue because our skeletons don't have the same width as our cards. So to ensure consistency, we have to apply the same width to both our cards and skeletons. So let's go to our game card skeleton and give this card a width of 300 pixels. And again, this is an arbitrary value. There is nothing magical here. You have to play with different values to see what works on different devices, okay? Now we have to apply the same width to our game card. So let's go to game card and give this card a width of 300 pixels. Now we have a duplication of this value in 2 different places, and this is bad because if tomorrow we have to change the width of this card, we have to remember to update it in 2 places. But for now, we don't want to get distracted with that. We just want to make this work. Then we'll come back and refactor our code, okay? Let's see if this solves our problem. So refresh, looking good. Now there is just a tiny issue. Our game cards have a higher border radius, so their corners are more round. Compare this corner with this one. Do you see the difference? One more time. There you go. So we have to apply the same border radius to our skeleton component. So here's our game card. We have set the border radius to 10 and overflow to hidden. We have to apply the same attributes to our skeleton component. Now let's test it one more time. Refresh. Okay, that looks perfect. Okay, we're done with this step, and now it's time to commit our code. But what about the issue with code duplication? We don't want to fix that in this commit, since our application is already in a working state. We don't want to risk breaking anything. What if our refactoring doesn't work? So let's commit our code to the repository first, and then we'll address the duplication issue in the next commit. So here I'm going to say show loading skeletons.